So good afternoon, everyone. I do apologize that I should probably have delayed this class until after Easter because there are some people in the class who are Christian who probably observe Easter. So I apologize for that. And it's not the most, uplifting topic on Easter either, but there is a connection actually, which is completely coincidental. I did not plan it this way. So today we're going to talk about the Holocaust. Now, we're not going to really talk that much about, the gory details of the Holocaust. What we're going to talk about more is how we got there. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to begin. So what we need to talk about is anti-Semitism more than anything else. Why is it that something like this could possibly happen? Of course, we see that prejudice is something that is not directed solely at Jews, but this is one of those really awful problems. So what we're going to talk about is what are the origins of anti-Semitism and how has it shaped the Jewish story? How is the Holocaust different than other expressions of anti-Semitism? And what are some of the Jewish responses to the Holocaust, theologically? Because how do you deal with the idea that, for example, God intervened supposedly in history for the Exodus, which we talked about last time, and yet somehow did not intervene here? So what do you do about that theological dilemma? So Anita Diamond, who wrote one of the books that some of you are reading, she says, it seems almost blasphemous to attempt to make sense out of the senseless slaughter of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. The photographs, film footage, diaries, and memoirs of survivors are excruciating. And yet the responsibility to remember is absolute and in some sense sacred. It is terrible to remember, it is worse to forget. So again, last week we talked about Passover, or we went through Passover, and we talked about the importance of remembering the history and about how if you don't remember the history, it does get forgotten, it gets erased. Unfortunately, I can't say that people actually learn from history. That is really one of the sad things, but maybe some of us can learn because we keep saying never again, but it does happen over and over again. Elie Wiesel, as you probably know, was a very important writer about the Holocaust. I consider him to be a prophet. And of course, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. He wrote various books, but probably the most famous is called Night. And he says, can this be true? In the 20th century, not the Middle Ages, how is it possible? And then, we come into the 21st century, by the way, and we get further Holocausts of one sort or another. Who would allow such crimes to be committed? How could the world remain silent? The world did know and remained silent. That is something that is really important. And it's very important for me, particularly given the fact that my family was in Auschwitz. How is it that you can, I remember my mother who was in Auschwitz, when she came out and looked around and saw people were just living their lives as though everything was normal. How is that even possible? So Elie Wiesel says, and that is why I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. This takes moral courage, of course, which you got to be willing to risk your life on some level. And a lot of people did risk their lives. So we're going to look at some of the origins of anti-Semitism. And let's start with the Bible. So Matthew 27, now you have to remember this is part of the New Testament. And Matthew was written decades after Jesus actually was alive. And so is it directly what happened, or is it history that's been colored by a need to prove something? And I don't want to be insulting to anybody who's a Christian, but I think this is partially revisionist history. So Matthew says, when the morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. So Jesus was a rabble rouser, a radical. He questioned whether the temple was being run in a way that was, with integrity, or whether it was corrupt. And people in power don't like to be confronted with their own corruption. So they didn't like him and they want to get rid of him. We know the story, okay? The story happens everywhere all the time. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to, this is Pontius Pilate, the governor. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" So the Romans were very cruel, and they would crucify people, as you know, hanging them up and letting them die as they're hanging on the cross, which is really a horrible, horrible way to die. And here, Pilate, who was a very cruel and horrible leader, supposedly is giving the crowd the option of getting rid of some petty criminal or of Jesus, who's really the guy who's a threat to his rule and to the rule of the Romans and to the upper classes that were corrupt. So if you really want to believe this, I suppose you can, but I don't. And I think that what happened was, and Linda, really, please feel free to correct me. I don't want to be insulting, but I think that when Christianity came along, they did not want to be on the bad side of the Romans. So they did not want to accuse the Romans of killing Jesus. So they're going to find another group to blame. And by the way, the Jews did not have the ability to give anybody the death penalty. Okay, they did not have that kind of power. So this seems very unlikely. So Pilate says, whom should I, free? So the chief priests, and those, of course, the Jews, and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Again, very unlikely. Pilate was not, someone who was going to give it to the Jews to deal with, but he's literally washing his hands of this responsibility. And this is the crucial piece. Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he, Pilate, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. This is a key verse for anti-Semitism, because the Jews are saying, not only are we taking responsibility for killing the Son of God and the Messiah, but it is also a responsibility on our children, on all our descendants from here ever after. And I got to tell you something that was shocking to me. There's a film called Shoah. It's a 9-hour film, which some of you may have seen. It's excellent, really. I do recommend it. It is 9 hours. And I saw this 30 or 40 years ago, and this just has stuck with me. Claude Lanzmann, the filmmaker, goes to Poland and interviews a group of people from Poland. And this is way after World War II, right? This is probably in the 80s. And they're standing on the steps of a church and they quote this verse. So it's not as though this is a verse that, oh, we've forgotten about it. No, people still refer to this verse as a reason for Jews. And by the way, you still hear kids saying, to other Jewish kids, you killed Christ. And there've been a lot of Jewish kids that have been beaten up for that. So I just want to make sure, Linda, have I said anything that is offensive? Where's Linda?
No, no.
Okay,
no.
thank you.
Although that verse only shows up in one of the 4 gospels. It's only in Matthew. It's not in Mark, Luke, or John.
Right, that's true. But it's there.
It's bad enough. I mean, it's bad enough it's there.
Yeah.
But it's
As I said, you know, years after the Holocaust, people are still quoting it, right? Even though, as Linda said earlier, that, and we're going to talk about Martin Luther in a moment, but that the Lutheran Church issued an apology to Jews in the 90s. So that's very much appreciated. Christine?
When I was in Catholic school as a kid, our nuns did not repeat this one. And that is the difference between the prior, the collaborationist fascist Pope that they had before and the Pope John the 23rd. That he ushered in this notion that this was never true, and so on and so forth. So the nuns never told us that, which is pretty interesting because you would expect that in the 50s, right? However, there's also been a number of scholarly works, including a lengthy article in The Nation some years ago on anti-Semitism without Jews about Poland.
Oh yes, there's an excellent book.
There's a big scholarship around it.
There's an excellent book called A Hole in the Heart of the World by Jonathan Kaufman about the effort to revive Jewish culture with no Jews.
When I lived in Boston, there was a real effort to save the first synagogue in Boston, which was sort of falling apart. And it was from a city in Poland, and one of the people said, "Why don't we start the predecessor of GoFundMe in Warsaw?" Everybody just looked at them and like, "Are you freaking kidding me?"
Right.
Like,
okay.
That's gonna happen.
So, all right. So we're going to go on because there's lots of other stuff. All right. So Merchant of Venice, just one of many, works of literature portraying Jews in a very stereotypical manner. So here is the Merchant of Venice talking about Shylock, who is a moneylender. Now you have to understand that Jews were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to join into guilds. They really had very, very limited options for, making a living. So one of the things they did was they collect taxes, which made them very unpopular, and they loaned money. So Solanio, I never heard a passion so confused, so strange, so outrageous, and so variable as a dog Jew did utter in the streets. And then quoting Shylock, "My daughter, oh, my ducats, oh, my daughter, fled with a Christian, oh, my Christian ducats, justice, the law, my ducats and my daughter. A sealed bag, 2 sealed bags of ducats, of double ducats, stolen from me by my daughter, and jewels, 2 stones, 2 rich and precious stones, stolen by my daughter. Justice, find the girl, she hath the stones upon her and the ducats." I mean, obviously all he cares about here is this money, right? That's the stereotypical concept about a Jew who is going to only care about their money. Then we have the Crusades in the medieval period. So it was originally to free the Holy Land from the Muslims, but on the way, they slaughtered thousands of Jews. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem. Christian crusaders set off to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. On the way, they slaughtered thousands of Jews. So that was a really horrible period, the medieval period, when, this was just one of many horrible things that happened to Jews in that period. Then there were all these libelous statements about Jews poisoning the wells because, when there's a plague, gee, who could we blame for that? Well, the Jews must have poisoned the wells, right? And so that was another story that went around. Now you think that, these crazy QAnon theories are a result of social media, but look at this. This is the medieval period. They did not have social media. And yet this is the kind of story that people believed. The Jews poisoned the wells. Then you've got the Inquisition. And expulsions from all kinds of countries, right? When Queen Isabella took over Spain and wanted to keep it very pure for Catholicism, let's kick the Jews out. And all these different countries. So what would happen is they would have Jews. Sometimes the Jews served a purpose. Maybe they were collecting taxes for the nobility. And so therefore they served this important purpose. So, you know, use them. Then when they were no longer useful, toss them out. Or maybe you wanted to, you know, keep the focus away from what the nobility and the royalty were doing. So, you know, blame the Jews and kick them out. Blood libel, another horrible conspiracy theory that, again, took place in the medieval period without social media. So there was this young boy, William of Norwich, who was found brutally murdered with strange wounds to his head, arms, and torso. His uncle was a priest or a monk, Thomas of Monmouth, and he blamed local Jews. And a rumor spread that Jews crucified a Christian child every year at Passover in order to make matzah. So you think that the idea of the Democrats eating children, okay, is something that was created in the 21st century. Go back to the 12th century and see that Jews are blamed for killing children in order to make matzah. And this is one of the reasons that Easter is somewhat connected to what we're talking about today, because Passover usually happens around the time of Easter. And, you know, you had all these passion plays also that would, you know, promote these libelous statements about Jews. Then you have the Protocols of Zion, which claim that, you know, the world is run by some kind of international Jewish conspiracy of, you know, wealthy bankers. Look whose name is on this book, Henry Ford, who promoted this lovely theory, right? And if you think this is something that only happened way back then, look at Amazon. You can buy this on Amazon, okay? $21.95 as a paperback, only $12.90 for hardcover, and 99 cents for Kindle. And this Protocols of Zion, by the way, has been translated into many, many languages. Of course, it's a hoax, but hey, tell that to QAnon about their theories. Pogroms. So in all these different countries, especially in Eastern Europe, pogrom is basically a mob-led violence, which is either promoted by the rulers, or they close their eyes to it and go right ahead and get out your aggression and kill a few Jews. And there were various horrible, horrible pogroms during the 19th century. One of the reasons that, you know, eventually there was a need to create a state of Israel for Jews to go to in safety. You think this is old stuff? This is a recent, very recent, like just a few months ago. I think it was in Belgium. This was a parade, okay, on the left, which looks very similar to a parade on the right, which is from Germany. Look at the noses on the Jews, because that's a stereotype, and the payas, which are the curly side locks there. And you don't have to go very far to see that all of this is still around, very, very sadly. And anti-Semitism, as you know, is alive and well all over the place, right? Rabbis have been stabbed. People have blown up Jewish institutions. You remember when there was that demonstration in Charlottesville, and it was about Jews will not replace us, among other things. Actually, anti-Semitism is very much at the foundation of white supremacy, because what they do is they blame the Jews for allowing people of color, gay people, etc., to get in so-called in the front of the line ahead of the white people who deserve it, right? So the Jews are responsible for making everybody miserable. Okay, Martin Luther. So Martin Luther came up with a reformation of the church. And he really thought, just like Muhammad thought in terms of Islam, that Jews would be drawn to his version of religion. And when they weren't, he got very, very angry. And he wrote some really nasty things. I'm just going to give you a few examples. We're not going to read everything that he wrote, but he wrote a lot of really awful things. So he says they're nothing but thieves and robbers who daily eat no morsel and wear no thread of clothing, which they have not stolen and pilfered from us by means of their accursed usury. Usury, of course, is about lending money and charging for it. Thus they live from day to day, together with wife and child, by theft and robbery, as arch thieves and robbers in the most impenitent security. And here's more. Alas, it cannot be anything but the terrible wrath of God, which permits anyone to sink into such abysmal, devilish, hellish, insane baseness, envy, and arrogance. If I were to avenge myself on the devil himself, I should be unable to wish him such evil and misfortune as God's wrath inflicts on the Jews, compelling them to lie and to blaspheme so monstrously in violation of their own conscience. Anyway, they have their reward for constantly giving God the lie. No one should toss out these lazy rogues by the seat of their pants, but then eject them forever from this country. For as we have heard, God's anger with them is so intense that gentle mercy will only tend to make them worse and worse, while sharp mercy will reform them but little. Therefore, in any case, away with them. Over and above that, we let them get rich on our sweat and blood while we remain poor, and they suck the marrow from our bones. So lovely, right? Okay, I'm going to stop for just a moment and see if anybody wants to ask questions or make any comments, or just take this in because it's pretty horrible. And as I said, the Lutheran Church has offered an apology for this, but of course it's influenced people. Okay, Tammy, you have a question or a comment?
It's just such a ridiculous common theme that, I mean, up until a few months ago, we were seeing in the public discourse, which is white establishment or powerful establishment threatened. Oh, let's find the scapegoat. Oh, look at those Jews. And it just keeps happening and happening and happening.
Yep.
And as Elie Wiesel said, remaining silent is the worst crime we can commit because it only enables. And then we see the narcissistic injury of people who feel threatened by any perceived power, and the desire and the rejection, and how that all culminates in this vociferous act of just blind rage.
Yeah.
And it really is incumbent upon us to speak up.
Absolutely. Kim?
Two thoughts. One, I wanted to share because my cousin and his wife, unfortunately, are QAnon conspiracy theorists. So I've seen some
Your
of their.
husband, not your husband.
No, my cousin.
Oh, your cousin. Your cousin. I thought you said your husband. Yeah. Okay.
And they've shared videos about adrenochrome, I think it is, that is extracted from the blood of children, and it keeps you young and powerful, and it's from the elites. And it's crazy to me how many people don't see the anti-Semitism in QAnon conspiracy theories, because it's not always explicit, but a lot of their beliefs align so much with what has been said about Jews throughout history, that they consume the blood of Christian children, and that they, abuse kids, and some other crazy thing. I forget what they said, but
very sad. Yeah. Shay?
It kind of made me reflect on current times now in the Black community and the Jewish community. And, when I think of music growing up in the 90s, I listened to a lot of rap. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism within rap at that time, which was sad because I didn't even know what I was listening to necessarily. But as looking back at some of the lyrics, whether it be Public Enemy or Ice Cube or other folks who were trying to push the Black community forward, but yet turning against the Jewish community in ways, you know, and it was sad because there were certain producers out there who were Jewish that were allowing this to happen, like you see in the Black community sometimes, where they remain silent, right?
Mm.
Or the income, I assume, or the fame or whatever comes with it. But it was just, it's difficult to see that because I see often two groups that have been so persecuted through history, but yet turn against each other. And I see that now with Hispanics and Blacks in Long Beach when I've worked as a counselor at middle school level. But it was always that kind of push of, you know, the folks that struggle to force them against each other in order to succeed, whoever that group may be.
That's how white supremacy works.
Yeah.
You do not allow people who have similar issues to bond with each other. You make them, you know, hate each other. But, you know, there was a time when Blacks and Jews were in alignment with each other, you know, in the 50s and 60s. That changed for a number of reasons. And there is an effort to try to mend that rift. But, you know, it's not completely successful. Okay, Doug?
When you're talking about two different groups, it's I was just watching a special a few days ago in Germany where there's the Jewish community is building, and for the first time in generations, rabbis are actually able to be trained in Germany. They go to Israel as well, but they're actually able to be trained in Germany. And the oddity is that there are anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim groups in Germany who are blaming the rise of the Muslims for the rise of the Jews, who in turn are making more Muslims within the society, and then pitting the Muslims and the Jews against each other in Berlin and Munich and a couple of other cities. And it's just, it is exactly what you were just saying. It's how people will pit other groups against one another, even though in most of the communities in Berlin and Munich and other places within Germany, the Muslim and the Jewish communities there's been a lot of cooperation and growth, being on the periphery of German society. And but now you have this running dialogue of it's the Jews who are doing things against the Muslims who are doing things against the Jews, when in reality they've been the largest support forces for each other within Germany.
You know, it's interesting is Germany has confronted its past in ways that we have not in this country. There's actually a very good book called Learning from the Germans by Susan, and I can't think of her last name right now, but she grew up in the South and she lives in Berlin now. But yeah, Germany has really confronted its past in many ways. If you go to Berlin, there's no way you don't run across some monument to the victims of the Holocaust or a museum about the Holocaust or whatever. And at the same time, there are a lot of Germans who are tired of taking the blame. Mm-hmm. And, you know, then with Muslims coming in because of, you know, Germany took in 1 million Syrians, mm-hmm. and there's a whole other element there of, you know, anti-Semitism and groups against each other. So it's very sad and very complicated. Okay, Brandon and then Christine, and then we'll move on. Brandon?
Something that frustrates me recently has been the anti-Semitism that's buried itself into society to the point where people don't realize they're saying things that are anti-Semitic. Like having to explain to people when they say, oh, you, all the Jewish bankers and all that. I'm like, I understand the fact that you've been told this for a long time, but that's actually really rude. Or the other thing that I started growing out my beard at the same time as I started my Intro to Judaism class. So I kept getting comments of, oh, are you trying to be one of those people with all the curls and all that? I'm like, no, I understand the fact that this is your view of Judaism, but there's a lot to Judaism, and I'm trying to use it as a moment of education rather than getting frustrated all the time of all the different things I'm noticing that people has just blended into the background of just the knowledge that people have.
That's great. If you can use it as a learning opportunity, that would be great. Yesterday, a friend of mine was talking about his brother and his father, who were very right-wing, very anti-Semitic, white supremacists. And he converted to Judaism, this friend of mine, and married a Jewish woman. And apparently his father was okay with that because Jews are good with money, quote. Yeah, that's all those stereotypes, terrible. Okay, Christine?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I've been trying to focus on in this like broad array of people that I know, including some of the QAnon people that you're talking about, is the way that denial gets phrased, moved. They know that it's un-PC to like to come out with like explicitly anti-Semitic stuff. So they use euphemisms. Oh, the Hollywood elite.
Mhm.
Or, you know, on and on, right? Che, you're smiling. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, sure.
And
Hollywood and
so there's that. And then, you know, when I have called out people for saying things like, oh, she really Jewed him down.
oh yeah, yep. I've heard
And
that one.
and things like that. Then they say, well, I didn't mean like real Jews. And I thought, oh yeah, just like these little imaginary ones walking around, right? And so it is everywhere, and
Yep.
it's constant. And because I look the way I do, of course, which doesn't fit a whole lot of stereotypes except maybe Irish people, and that I get this like I'm in on it, you know, that somehow I get included, and it's like so unclean, you know,
Yep.
it's just horrendous to be implicated.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
anyway, but
Yeah.
the euphemisms and the denial that gets involved in that is one of the major ways that it gets reproduced.
And you can see how there's a slippery slope. Oh, you know, Jewing somebody down, money. And then, you know, you hear a conspiracy theory and then you go, yeah, you know, I kind of heard something about that. Yeah, maybe they are sucking us dry, you know, and taking all the jobs or giving them to Black people or whatever it is that people come up with, you know. So it's really sad. All right, now we're going to move on to emancipation. So Vive la République, right? So we had all these revolutions, and in France and Germany and various places. And so all of a sudden Jews are able to come out of the ghetto, right? And have citizenship. Isn't that great? But equality for most people means sameness, not diversity, okay? So you want to have equal rights? Well, you should act like us and look like us, right? And if you don't, then there's a problem. So the slogan was, to the Jews, everything, and to the Jews as a nation, nothing. In other words, you cannot be a separate group of people, right, with your own identity. And interestingly, as Jews were accepted as citizens, anti-Semitism became more virulent. Now you would think that, oh, I'm getting to know people who are Jewish, so I'll find out that they're actual human beings just like me. No. Two reasons. One, Jews didn't change enough, or they changed too much. In other words, if they didn't change enough, oh, they're still weird, right? They still wear these weird things, or they have these weird curls on their head, or whatever it is that they're different. Or they change so much that they are infiltrating us, right? They're sneaking into all these places. So Jews are taking over. For example, they're only 1% of the population, yet look how high a percentage of university students they are in 1870, right? They're spies. They're coming in and trying to find out what we're doing so they can get rid of us. And Jews acculturated but didn't assimilate. In other words, acculturation means you can, you know, be out there with other people who are different, and you can, you know, understand their culture and engage in the culture, but you still are who you are, as opposed to assimilating where your differences are completely erased. And then there were complaints about, well, you know, the government's now become secular. We're lacking Christian values. We've heard that in this country. By the way, in Riverside, you probably remember a number of years ago that there was an outfit out of DC that is committed to splitting state and religion. So they go around looking for places where that's not the case. So on Mount Rubidoux, you had a cross, and that spit of land belongs to the city. Well, there's a cross on it. That's not separating church and state. So they decided they were going to, you know, either sue us or something to get rid of that cross. And don't you know that within a very, very short time, Money was raised, $10,000, I believe, to buy that spit of land to preserve that cross, because people were saying, we are a Christian city. That is our history. So, you know, and I'm sure you've heard politicians talking about Christian values, right? Without Christian values, this country's going to the dogs, right? Okay, then you have a new form of anti-Semitism. So we looked at Martin Luther and we looked at Matthew. That was religious anti-Semitism, which means that you could theoretically convert and become a Christian, and therefore you got rid of your Jewish background. But there's this new theory of racial anti-Semitism, which, by the way, was inspired by some stuff in this country, the eugenics studies that were done here. So it's no longer based on religion, but on science, and you cannot convert out of it. It's in your blood. And blood makes Jews swinish. And especially in Germany, we wanted a very pure race. We don't want that Jewish blood messing us up. And there were even efforts to prove that Jesus was not Jewish, because after all, that would make him swinish, right? And you see here a picture of a Jew with a very Aryan-looking person. This is Germany, of course. And another picture up in the corner that shows a beautiful shiksa, blonde, non-Jewish woman next to this hideous-looking man who's Jewish. And of course, we don't want them taking our women. I'm sure you can relate to that when you think about the same thing was said about Black people. So now we're going to focus on Germany. So there had been a monarchy that was replaced by a democratic republic, the Weimar Republic, and Jews were blamed for that because it was not Christian. It was a secular republic. So there was harsh treatment by the Allies after World War I, right? So Germans were defeated very badly during World War I, and they had to pay very large reparations, and they were humiliated. Not a good place to be. So as I said, Jews were blamed for this republic. It was called the Juden Republic. And the heavy toll of reparations. So in 1923, $1 was worth 4 trillion marks. I mean, people were actually being paid with wheelbarrows of money because the mark was worthless. Then the crash of 1929 resulted in a lot of people being out of work. And what happens? We've seen that in this country recently. What do people want when they're humiliated? When the economy is in terrible shape? They want a strong leader to make them feel that they still have dignity, that they still have power. So law and order started breaking down. And in 1933, the Chancellor Hindenburg gives the police ministry to the Nazis. And communists are arrested and jailed. And this is a slippery slope of give them a little bit of power. Well, within a very short time, Hitler gets absolute power. And eventually all organizations are Nazified, and it becomes a one-party state within 6 months. So it does not take long for this to happen, as you can see. And it didn't take long for something very close to this happening in this country. We escaped by a hair, and we're not out of the woods yet, because you still have a lot of people who are out of work or who have had middle-class jobs that paid for a middle-class lifestyle and a certain kind of dignity again. And those people, primarily white men, have lost a lot of those jobs, are either working for minimum wage or not working, and they feel powerless and they want to feel power. And if someone says, make America great again, that means that's when white people were in charge and had good jobs and got to keep other people down. The Nuremberg laws in 1935. So we're seeing how little by little we're going to take Jews and make them into pariahs, because here's the problem. At this point, Jews are very integrated into the society. They have positions of importance. They're married to non-Jews. They're married to non-Jews. How do you take them out of this fabric of society, pull them out and make them into pariahs? So little by little, it's like the frog in the boiling water. You put a frog in cold water and start boiling it. The frog does not notice that it's going to be boiled to death because it's little by little by little. So you start having citizenship laws for the protection of German blood and German honor. So you start forbidding Jews and citizens of Germany or kindred blood are forbidden. A citizen of the Reich is that subject only who is of German or kindred blood, and who through his conduct shows that he is both desirous and fit to serve the German people and Reich faithfully. If you have Jewish blood, you cannot be a German citizen. The first violent moment was Kristallnacht, because before that you had these laws, you're little by little pulling the Jews out of the fabric of society, and you were Nazifying all the different parts of society, meaning you had to be a member of the Nazi Party, which of course you couldn't be if you were German. And if you weren't a member of the Nazi Party, you could not, do a number of things, have a number of jobs. Eventually, you could do almost nothing. But it wasn't violent until this moment. Kristallnacht is a night of broken glass. It was a pogrom against Jews carried out by the paramilitary forces of Germany and by civilians throughout Nazi Germany. And the authorities did not intervene. Synagogues were burnt, Jews were killed, and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The US response. You would think that maybe the US would have done something about this. Nope. There were 20,000 orphans or children who, were being sent away by their parents so they could survive. And actually, there was a woman she was married to somebody in the Roosevelt administration who said, yeah, they're cute now, but when they grow up, they're going to be, ugly, horrible Jews. So they refused to pass a law admitting 20,000 unaccompanied children. The USS St. Louis with German refugees was turned back, not allowed to land here. Some of the reasons: fear of communism. So Jews were communists, right? And Stalin was considered worse than Hitler at the time. Unemployment. We were having a depression here as well. So these refugees are going to take our jobs. Anti-Semitism. Father Coughlin was a very popular radio figure who was very anti-Semitic. Isolationism. We know about that. We just went through that again. And quota laws. Only 150,000 a year were allowed in. We have just been through that here as well with immigration issues, right? So the US said no. When did the US actually enter the war? What was the prompt for the US entering the war, Christine?
It was 1941 in December, and it was only because Pearl Harbor was attacked.
Exactly. We didn't go in there as great
anti-fascist. Actually, a number of anthropologists tried, including Eleanor Leacock, tried to join the OSS, the Office of Secret Service, early because Margaret Mead had been hired when the U.S. was ready to join the war, and Leacock was refused the security clearance because of what the U.S. called premature anti-fascism, because she had supported the loyalists in Spain. So there was also that if you in fact did that. Stanley Diamond, another anthropologist who was my advisor, he joined the British Army because the US was not part of the war, and to fight fascism. And later on, none of the Americans that joined with the British early on were allowed to get any military pensions in the US because of premature anti-fascism.
So, there were definitely Americans that helped. I mean, there were people, there was a couple whose name I cannot think about. I can't remember the name right now, but they actually went into Germany to save children. In fact, there was a film that we showed here called 50 Children that was produced by the husband of one of the grandchildren. So there were people who did feel that they needed to do something, but the government of Roosevelt, as wonderful as Franklin Roosevelt was in so many ways, was not responsive to this. They could have bombed the railroad tracks that led to Auschwitz. They chose not to do that. They could have taken people in. They chose not to do that. And there were many reasons, but part of it was definitely anti-Semitism in the administration. Any comments, questions? No?
It was interesting at the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and going through, and there was on the section that talks about the St. Louis and not being able to dock in the United States, and how it then went to Cuba. And what I didn't realize is that we convinced the Cuban government to not allow them to dock in Cuba.
Lovely.
Cuba had said, okay, if the United States won't take them, we'll take them. And then the United States, through the embassy, told Cuba, if you do that, there'll be significant ramifications from the United States. So then they couldn't go. So then they said they could go to Venezuela. Venezuela said no after Cuba said no. I mean, it wasn't that we just said no. I mean,
Yeah,
that
we
was bad
also
enough.
convinced others.
But
right?
we actually took the additional step to convince other nations within the Western Hemisphere that it wasn't a good idea to allow them to dock, and then sent them back to
Right.
port in Hamburg. Yeah.
And as Sasha points out, Roosevelt also put the Japanese in concentration camps here. Very sad. We're in a culture right now where we're, condemning people for doing awful things, even if they did wonderful things. So it gets very complicated because Roosevelt did some wonderful things, and yet he did some horrible things. So what do you do about that? Shay?
Yeah, I just, as current times too, the attack on the Capitol Hill, how harsh that was to watch live as I sat there and saw it, and shirts such as, 6 million wasn't enough or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the United States still not always, if you're white typically, and they're not calling them terrorists, right? That whole term terrorist is yet thrown away for the fact in, calling it what it is. And that's frustrating because of the fact that still we turned a blind eye, I feel sometimes, to those racist fellows or folks who attack the Capitol, and I know that they're arresting them now, but it just doesn't sit well with me. And it scared me because seeing past historical events, I'm like, what's next?
But you don't have to go too far to see the difference in how the people on January 6th were treated by the police and the people who were protesting, in favor of Black lives, right? Very different.
Right.
Christine, did you have your hand up? Okay, your little blue hand is up, but maybe that was from before. Okay, so we're going to go.
I think Bobby wanted to say
Bobby?
something. Yeah.
Okay, Bobby.
I was waving for Beverly. Go ahead.
No, I don't think the depth of my understanding of what the Holocaust, how it could have possibly happened, changed, I think, after Trump, after witnessing how unbelievable, how people needed so desperately to believe what he was selling, and how so many people bought into it, that you could begin to understand how you could change a country,
Yes.
I think we came much closer than anybody.
Oh. And we're going to look at a couple theories about whether this was very specific to Germany or not.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
I just, to add to that, if you look at somebody like Josh Hawley,
Yeah.
Who has been educated,
Yes.
who, at, elite institutions, who is selling this lie, who is saying,
Yeah.
it's part and
Yes.
parcel.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
it's the same thing as anti-Semitism in a
look
way.
at Germany. Germany
yeah,
was a highly civilized society with art and culture at its absolute apogee, right? Philosophers and composers and writers and poets, and these are the people who are highly anti-Semitic.
Exactly.
So
It's-
it's not about intelligence.
Yes.
No.
That's right.
No.
And unfortunately, that's why, as much as I applaud Brandon for trying to educate people at the moment, facts don't change people's minds.
No.
Unfortunately, it's about emotion.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to look at a couple more things. Oh,
Okay.
Christine?
I just, it also comes down to sort of familial dynamics and everything else. I mean, it really starts with everyone and the people around you, as well as the structural issues, the structural oppressions and exploitation. But my father was a military officer, and he was the advisor to General Marshall. And he knew, I mean, after the war, my mother bitterly asked him one night, why didn't you agree to be on the Nuremberg trial panel? Okay. And this is one of the things that I wear as constant atonement, right? And he said, because Peggy, if we'd lost the war, I'd be on trial. Because he knew where the lines were. He knew all of that stuff and did nothing. And so, my mother was shaken, but then she had 5 little kids, no way of making a living, no divorce in those days. I mean, then how do you live with this? How do you live with that weight of knowing that your own people were killed basically by your husband? And so on. It really, not to mention, hi daddy, we love you.
Even though that's a very direct kind of sense of responsibility, look, we're privileged in this country, us. And it's often at the detriment of people in the developing world, or people even in our own country. I mean, I read this really, really excellent book. It's not a new book, but it's Strangers in Their Own Land. It's about people in Louisiana who live where all this oil is being, explored and exploited. And they've gotten really sick with cancer and all that from all the stuff being in their environment, so that we can drive our cars. I mean, it is always some sense of responsibility for, or, our phones. I think I've mentioned this before, like, where do the minerals in these phones come from, right? Congo, where there are warlords who are, exploiting people to go in the mines and mine all this and killing. We have responsibility for a lot of people suffering in order for us to have the privileged lives we have. So it's very difficult to figure out, how to live a life with integrity, and if you're not off the grid, it's really hard, I think, right? Or even I try to invest in socially responsible stocks, but all of a sudden I look at my portfolio and there's like, what's that company?
Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs. Thank you, Roger. Goldman Sachs. Now, is that a pure company? No. I called up my broker. I go, wait a minute. I thought this was socially responsible investing. Well, where are you going to do it? So, all right, let's look at one more thing and then we're going to take a break. Okay. So initially, the solution to getting rid of Jews was something called the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units. So it'd be squads of German SS and police personnel who would often draw on local civilian and police support to carry out mass murder operations. The German army provided logistical support, including supplies, transportation, housing, occasionally manpower. And what did they do? They would round people up and take them off into the forest, have them dig their own graves and shoot them. And people would just drop into those graves. And believe it or not, some people survived that. You know, they pretended they had died and they stayed there until they were able to escape. But most people, of course, were killed, women, children, men, etc. The reason that the Einsatzgruppen were not continued, there are a couple of reasons. One is, just imagine what it was like to go out there as just an ordinary German civilian, even if you were a policeman or whatever, and going out and shooting all these people, women and children. It was demoralizing and horrible. It was expensive. You had to use a lot of ammunition. And then when Germany started taking over more and more land, Poland, Russia, there were too many Jews to round up and kill this way. And therefore they had to come up with a much more efficient way of killing Jews. It's 2:01, so at 2:11 we'll come back. How's everybody doing? I know this is a really tough topic.
Yeah,
And
doing good.
yeah, you're okay.
You're doing a great job, Rabbi,
Thank you.
because it isn't an easy topic. And I really
No.
appreciate, I mean, having had this topic in a variety of different, I appreciate you and what you bring to many topics, but especially this particular topic.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I do have a very personal sort of stake in it because my mother was in Auschwitz. And if I have time, I will talk a little bit about that, but you know, it's going to be hard because there's so much to cover. So I just want to see.
My family was killed during the war.
I know many of us, you know, Jewish people have that in our background. And of course, there were also, let's not forget the fact that there were 10 million people killed. So there's another 4 million, which were gay people and gypsies and people with various kinds of other challenges. And there were like 1.5 million children. So it's pretty horrible. But we're going to have to resume, unfortunately. Yeah, Linda.
Well, and there was also a lot of people that tried to help the Jews too, right?
Absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well.
I know one of our Lutheran theologians, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was killed in a concentration camp just weeks before the war ended because
Yes.
of trying to help.
They're called righteous Gentiles. And at Yad Vashem, which is the memorial to the Holocaust in Israel, there's a whole section devoted to those people. So there were definitely people who helped. And we're not going to be able to go into too much detail about that, but there were people who hid people, you know, in their attics or in their basements who risked their own lives. And some of them did get killed and they risked their own families' lives. I would like to actually promote something for all of you, and I will send you the links for this next week. On April 8th, which is next Thursday, at 6 o'clock, this is Yom HaShoah, it's Holocaust Remembrance Day. And we are going to bring a woman named Alison Owings, who's an author, who wrote a book called Frauen about the German women during the war and what they were thinking and doing. That'll be followed by a short service. And then over the weekend, we are showing a film called Resistance, which you have to register for in order to get the password. And I'll send you all the information about that. But it's about a mime, a French mime named Marcel Marceau, which some of you may have heard of, whom some of you may have heard of. He helped save thousands of children by, I mean, really, again, risking his own life with other people and taking them across the border to Switzerland from France. So, you know, there were people who really did risk their lives. And actually, there's some films about this, like Weapons of the Spirit, about a village in southern France that was led by a Protestant minister who saved a lot of Jews as well. You have Denmark, where people wore the yellow star in solidarity with the Jews. What's really interesting, and you have nuns who hid people, and priests, and there were a lot of people who did really wonderful, courageous work. And what's amazing about it is that when they've been interviewed, they don't see that they did anything particularly heroic. It's like, well, of course, this is what you do. I've always been stunned by that, because it takes so much courage to do what they did. And so there are a number of books and a number of films that have been written about all these wonderful people. So definitely, that's the sort of slightly positive element of this story. Okay, so we're going to look at the final solution briefly. So believe it or not, until 1941, Jews were allowed to leave Germany. Hitler just wanted them out of there. Where to go? As we saw, the US did not let people come in. Just think about the immigrants today who are fleeing Central America because of violence and persecution and terrible economic conditions, some of which we're responsible for, but that's another story that we'll get to some other time in some other class. But these people are fleeing for their lives. Now, obviously, we can't just have open borders, but at the same time, you have to have some compassion for them. Because just as the Jews had nowhere to go, they have nowhere to go. Where are they going to go? And we've been pretty cruel to them. And it's not just under the last administration, because as much as I admire Obama, he was called the deporter in chief. So it's a complicated problem, but hopefully President Biden will do something to alleviate the horrible situation at the border. So as I mentioned earlier, once Poland was invaded and then the Soviet Union, what do you do with all these Jews? You can't just go around shooting them. The Einsatzgruppen, as I mentioned, they killed like 1.5 million Jews, but they used up too much ammunition and it was very demoralizing. Well, Zyklon B, which is a pesticide, was way more efficient. So in 1942, there was a conference in Wannsee, and that's where the logistics for the final solution were implemented. And he also had something called the Judenrat, which are, organizations of Jewish leaders in a community who would have to decide who was going to be sent off to a camp. And this is Jews sending Jews to their deaths, okay? And why? Because they thought, well, if I don't do it, someone else is going to do it. And if I don't do it, I'll get killed, right? And there were some men who said, no, I will not participate in this. However, they were killed and replaced, or they committed suicide because they just couldn't face doing this. They figured, well, maybe I can just save my friends and my family, or maybe I can just save some of the strong men and, I'll save some in exchange for maybe some older people who are going to die anyway. So you had a system where you had the people inside the Jewish communities who were participating in their own deaths. What the final solution was you create these death camps, you gather people up, and unfortunately the Judenrat was, those groups of Jews who ran the ghettos were responsible very often for sending Jews off to their death. And you may have seen film about this where, people were taken into what they thought were going to be showers. They turned it on and they got Zyklon B and were gassed to death. And unfortunately, something that you would see if you watch the Shoah, that film that I mentioned earlier, and other films, the Jews were the ones who had to then collect these people, their bodies, and put them in the ovens to burn them. Just imagine, and we can't judge those people. I mean, you think, oh, how could they have done that? Well, what do you do? You see people from your own village walking into the gas chambers. So I'll just mention that my mother was assigned to work in a place called Canada, Kanada, where they sorted through the clothing of the people who were being gassed. And of course, the whole time, flame, fire and smoke going up from the from the ovens as people are being burnt to death. Can't judge what people did to survive. Just cannot do it. Okay, so we're gonna continue here. Here is a cattle car. It is actually an art piece. It's not an actual cattle car. But just imagine the way people were transported to Auschwitz or to any of the many, many death camps that were around. And by the way, if you weren't gassed to death, you were also, you were worked to death. So one way or the other, very few people survived because you were given very little food. You were freezing to death in the winter, and you were made to stand for many, many, many hours to be counted over and over again. But on the way to the concentration camp, you were put in a cattle car, and that's the way many people also died, because you were just jammed in there for days with no food or water, nowhere to go to the bathroom, etc. So I'm not going to go into detail about what happened in the camps. I think most of us know what that was all about. But we will just talk about how many camps there were. 42,500 camps and ghettos. There were 30,000 slave labor camps. Some of the slave labor was Jews working in munitions plants and the like, but some of it was just make-do work. For example, my mother had to move rocks and big rocks and things on a road, just make do to torture people. And there were all these ghettos that were emptied out eventually, 980 concentration camps, and 1,000 POW camps. Then there were brothels. So again, my mother told me that one day she was on the list to be sent to a brothel in the on the front lines to serve as soldiers. And of course, he would then die of a venereal disease. She managed to get off that list, and that's another story that if we have time, I'll tell you. Camps to euthanize the elderly and the infirm. And they think that maybe 15 to 20 million people may have died, not just in the concentration camps, but in the ghettos as well, because in the ghettos, they were starving too. And so a lot of people died in the ghettos before they even got to the concentration camps. All right, now the question is, was this a very specific German thing or not? So Daniel Goldhagen, who's a Harvard person, says that the destruction of European Jewry was a predictable consequence of Germany's widespread and virulently homicidal anti-Semitism, which was a fixture of the German social landscape long before the fall of the Weimar Republic. And so he wrote this book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. To tell you the truth, I actually disagree with him, and I'll tell you why. Maybe there was something in Germany that made it particularly horrible, but Christopher Browning wrote a book called Ordinary Men. So his theory is it could happen with anybody. And I do recommend these. Well, I particularly recommend his book, The Hitler's Willing Executioners. I don't find convincing. There was a lot of social pressure, right? People could have said no. They didn't have to go and join the Einsatzgruppe, and yet they did. And we've just discussed throughout the last couple of hours how the circumstances that existed in Germany to some extent exist in this country, and how we came close to doing not exactly concentration camps, but certainly some of the elements of Nazi Germany. So, and it's happened all over the place. It's happened in Cambodia. It's happened, the killing fields of Cambodia. It's happened so much. So I want to point out, some of you may have heard about the Milgram experiments. So Stanley Milgram created this experiment where he had somebody posing as a scientist. And he brought in people and he said to them, okay, I want you to make this person who's in this other room, the orange room, learn something. And if they keep messing up, you administer an electric shock, right? So they measured the willingness of study participants, who were men from a diverse range of occupations, varying levels of education. So, nobody from a particular, group of people, how much they were willing to obey an authority who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. So they were led to believe that they were administering these shocks. They weren't really doing it, but that's how the person L responded, as though they were really getting the shock. This was L for learner. So when the person who was being tested was told, okay, this guy screwed up again, give him more electricity in the shock that he's going to get, the person more often than not did it, even though the so-called learner was reacting as though, they had gotten this incredible amount of electricity. But because the person, I think who's wearing a white coat, would say, do it, it's okay, the person did it. That is one of a number of experiments that were done to show that people will listen to authority and they will obey, even if it looks like you're really hurting another person. And I'll tell you about another experiment. This one was done at Stanford by a guy named Phil Zimbardo. You may have heard of this experiment as well. He took people off the street, he made sure they weren't, psychologically damaged in any way. They were just plain old people who were healthy psychologically. And he divided them in two. One group was prisoners and the other group were guards. People got into the experiment so much that they had to stop the experiment. Because the people who had the authority to be guards and who could be cruel got into that role, and the prisoners got into the role of being people who were victims. And it was just an experiment. It wasn't even real guards or real prisoners. And that is, to me, a very clear indication of how easy it is to fall into those roles. Just imagine if you were a prison guard, an actual prison guard, how you would behave. And you've been, told that Jews are swine or dogs or vermin. How easy is it to treat them like that? So I just want to take a moment and see, if anybody wants to respond to that. If you've heard of those experiments, Tammy?
As a psychologist, this is something we all learn grad school year one, but as a police psychologist, when I do hiring, this is also something we look at very, very closely, because we know that people of color are treated so very differently, and that there's such a thin line between doing what we think is right and then being forced to do that which the group in power forces us to in order to survive. And I think the line between good people and bad people is much thinner than most of us even imagine. And I think having survived the Trump administration really showed us how thin that line really is. And the people that some of us knew who never thought would align with the Trumpettes, I think that all gave us pause. And I think it's really important to remember that good people and bad people, we're all people, and we all have our limits, and we can all screw it up, and we can all do horrible things, and be the victim of circumstance if we're not careful. So it's also a reality check for all of us. We're all good people, but under the right stressors and right circumstances, human beings are capable of most anything.
Remember that for Purim, we're supposed to drink until we can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. And I do think that that has something to do with what you're saying right now, which is we're on a spectrum. You know, yeah, I guess there's some people who are really evil and there's some people who are saintly, but most of us are on the spectrum. We could go one way or the other depending on the circumstances. And we'd like to believe that we're not capable of these horrible, cruel things, but the fact is we are. Christine?
I keep thinking that there's the only sort of patterns that make it the Holocaust and subsequent genocides different from earlier forms of oppression and the pogroms and so on is the degree of bureaucratization, calling people professionals who are doing the extermination, keeping records, which is my favorite part of the whole thing, right? And also trying to find the efficiencies of capitalism in the whole thing, and the profit that, of course, wasn't really involved, but nevertheless, the looting of bodies, and trying to find ways of utilizing this to turn a profit is just, those are the differences from earlier forms of violent anti-Semitism to me.
Yes, yes. In terms of any kind of Holocaust, this was the most efficient, as you said, bureaucratic, technologically perfected one.
Can I add one thing? It was also used as a model in South Africa and for setting up apartheid and the Bantustans, because the Bantustans were set up in places where survival was extremely difficult, if not impossible. And so the death rates, until they banned keeping records on this in 73, the death rate for children under the age of 1 was more than 50%. And so, I mean, and it was explicitly a model that the sort of Boer fascist government set up during World War II and afterwards.
And
So,
in terms of the records, for those who want to deny that this ever happened or happened to the extent that it did, the Germans kept great records and film. I just want to point out a couple of things in the chat. So Kim says that Netflix has an excellent documentary about a Nuremberg trial prosecutor called Prosecuting Evil. And Tammy says the Stanford prison experiment is also on Netflix, and it really shows how good people can quickly behave badly under the right stressors. Thank you for those references. Any other, Bobby? I think you're muted.
okay, one more thing. In preparation for April 8th and Alison Owens Franklin's work, there's also Claudia Kunz's Mothers in the Fatherland, which is an historian's spin on the transformation of reproductive law, marriage, and the cult of womanhood that the Nazis tried to put up.
Thank you.
That's a phenomenal book.
It's
That is
great.
truly a phenomenal work.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Bobby?
I just wanted to say quickly that when I heard those experiments, I kept, this might seem simplistic, but for a long time, I felt that feminism was an answer to this, that women somehow could stand up and be different and change things. But I'm seeing now, as women are getting power in our country, we're starting to see some of the same behaviors. Marjorie.
I have 2 words for you, Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
And Margaret Thatcher, I know, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't, I have to say, I've worked for women. I don't find them to be more communal and
or humane.
non-hierarchical and compassionate. Okay, I have to say, that's kind of an essentialist argument, which I don't buy myself, but it's a nice thought.
But I think that what the experiments do show is that it explains Trump women. It explains Republican,
Right.
very well.
Yeah. I just
Yeah.
wanted to add one thing. Have you heard about the podcast, Those Who Were There?
No.
A very close friend of ours, Eric Marcus, who does Making Gay History, was contacted by Yale University. They have an entire library of the testimonials of people who are in concentration camps, and he's turned it into a podcast, and it's called
Thank
Those Who Were There, Voices from the Holocaust. So I highly recommend it. They did one season and now they were picked up. They're going to do another season, and we've listened to, it's just
Maybe we can
unbelievable.
send Suzanne a link and then she could send it out.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Those
Okay.
Who Were There. Yeah.
Okay, quickly, Christine, because we have to move on.
Really quickly on that same line, there's a fabulous documentary that interviews 6 women who never knew each other, but who were all in Auschwitz at different times. And it's called Swimming in Auschwitz. It's a fantastic documentary.
Thank you. There are a lot
Yeah.
of documentaries. As a matter of
This is
fact,
very recent, though.
yeah.
You know.
As a matter of fact, oddly enough, when I worked at PBS for many years, and it just so happened that that's when the children of Holocaust survivors were making films. And so I got all of those films. And also, when I went to HUC, Hebrew Union College, I was asked, would you like to be a TA at USC? Because Hebrew Union College teaches the Jewish studies classes at USC. And of course, what was the course? The Holocaust. So, yeah, Linda.
Just real quickly, a couple weeks ago on PBS, I watched a documentary that was made in 2020 called The Windermere Children.
Windermere?
Windermere Children. It was children who were taken after the end of the war. They were children from the concentration camps and the labor camps that were taken to England. And they worked with these children to kind of assimilate them into the community. The youngest child, I think, was 3 years old, and to teenagers. And it was really good. And they interviewed some of the people afterward who were actually part of this Windermere Children group.
Thank you. Okay, we are, there are lots of films that have been mentioned in the chat, so people can copy that. We're gonna have to move on, otherwise we're not gonna cover some important issues. So, all right. Anne Frank, you probably all have heard of Anne Frank. She was hidden for a long time and then eventually sent to Auschwitz. And she still believes in the goodness of people, which is pretty amazing. And of course, the Diary of Anne Frank is something that's worth reading. There were partisans who fought against the Nazis. They, and this is a partisan song, which I don't think we have time to listen to right now. If we do, I'll go back to it. But important to know, yes, there were many Jews who were taken like sheep to the slaughter, but there are also Jews who fought back. Here's resistance. So many Jews in ghettos across Eastern Europe tried to organize resistance against the Germans and to arm themselves with smuggled and homemade weapons. There were about 100 groups, resistance groups, between 41 and 43. The most famous one was the armed fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto. So Jews fought against the Germans in the Warsaw Ghetto. It began after German troops and police entered to deport the ghetto's surviving inhabitants. And, when people say, well, why didn't the Jews fight back? Well, they didn't have, armaments, for one thing, but 750 fighters did fight the heavily armed and well-trained Germans, and they held out for about a month. Unfortunately, within a month, the revolt ended and the Germans crushed the resistance. More than 56,000 Jews were captured and 7,000 were shot, and the remainder were deported to concentration camps. There was also resistance in the Vilna ghetto. So it's important to know that the Jews did try to fight back. They also, in the armament factories, they also tried to do some sabotaging. So there was an effort to do this. It's just, they were fighting against, the impossible enemy. Okay, something about rescuers, important. We talked a little bit about that before. So this is one book of many. Malka Drucker is a rabbi, and she and Gay Block put together this book of rescuers. As I mentioned before, they risked their lives. Most people were bystanders or collaborators, right? Bystanders because, yeah, I don't want to get involved. Collaborators because they got some reward for it, or because they really, hated Jews. And when people did rescue Jews, they were expressing their innermost values that were important to them. As I said, they're not typical heroes. They did not think of themselves as heroes. And their heightened sense of empathy overrode Nazi propaganda and their own instinct for self-preservation. It's a little bit like the midwives in the story of the Exodus, because the midwives were not sure if they were Egyptian or Hebrew. If they were Egyptian, they really, fought against what was the prevailing culture. If they were Hebrews, they were very, very courageous slaves. And either way, they just said, no, we're not doing this. We're not participating in this. We're going to save these children. So of course, these people had a very strong moral foundation. And again, there are a number of films and books about rescuers. One of my friends, Eva Fogelman, who's also a psychologist, wrote a book about rescuers and what they were made of. I brought her here a few years ago to talk during Yom HaShoah. I don't remember the book right at the moment, but I can send you the title. Then, we all know about Spielberg, but there were also other people who saved Jews. So again, Righteous Among the Nations. So this was the Chinese consul general in Vienna who issued Chinese passports to Chinese visas, to Shanghai, to people who requested them, in spite of orders from his superior to the contrary. And he saved thousands of Jews. And a lot of Jews ended up in Shanghai, one of the few places where they were able to go. And a friend of mine has done research on that, and I had brought her here a few years ago to talk about this particular gentleman who, also was very courageous. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about theology. Let me just look at the chat for a second. Thank you, Suzanne. Okay, the book by my friend Eva Fogelman is called Conscience and Courage, Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust. Thank you very much. I'm glad that it's almost like I have a brain out there with people who are able to fill in where I cannot remember things. So thank you. All right, Emil Fackenheim. So there were a number, obviously, there have been many, many theologians trying to grapple with this problem of the Holocaust. How is it possible that this happened when God is supposed to be good and just and all powerful, which obviously God cannot be both? And he came up with this idea of the 614th commandment. So you know that there are 613 commandments traditionally in Judaism. So his 614th commandment is not to give Hitler a posthumous victory by abandoning Judaism. So he says we're commanded first to survive as Jews, lest the Jewish people perish. We're commanded second to remember in our very guts and bones the martyrs of the Holocaust, lest their memory perish. We are forbidden, thirdly, to deny or despair of God, however much we may have to contend with him or with belief in him, lest Judaism perish. We are forbidden, finally, to despair of the world as a place which is to become the kingdom of God, lest we help make it a meaningless place in which God is dead or irrelevant. And everything is permitted. To abandon any of these imperatives in response to Hitler's victory at Auschwitz would be to hand him yet other posthumous victories. He is one of several theologians. I'll mention a couple of other ones. Yitz Greenberg, who's a modern Orthodox rabbi, wrote a very powerful piece. And it's based on an interview or questioning that was done at the Nuremberg trials. So there was a soldier who said that when they decided to kill the babies, it was too expensive to use bullets to kill them first. So they just tossed them into the fire. alive, 1,000 burning babies. And Yitz Greenberg says, any theology that you come up with has to be something that you can justify in front of the image of 1,000 burning babies. So he talks about something called moments faith. In other words, you cannot any longer discern your faith based on how profound or deep it is. It's how frequent it is. How many moments you can have faith, because there are times when you cannot have it. I mean, that's his perspective. Okay, so Suzanne Mallory says, Christine Monroe also has a good book on the same topic, The Hand of Compassion, Portraits of Moral Choice During the Holocaust. Linda, do you have your hand up? Oh, is that from before? So, you know, there are different ways of grappling with this really difficult dilemma. You know, how do you deal with this? And actually, Emil Fackenheim's 614th commandment really resonates for me personally, as does Moments Faith, because this is a modern Orthodox rabbi, Yitz Greenberg, who says, you know, how do you justify your theology in front of the image of 1,000 babies being tossed into the fire? You know, and there are times you just can't, times you just can't. Then you also have poetry. Here's a really powerful poem by Don Pagas. And this is the whole poem. Here in this carload, I am Eve with Abel, my son. If you see my other son, Cain, son of man, tell him that I couldn't be finished. Person's being taken away in a railway car. Then you have Leo Baeck. Leo Baeck was a German rabbi who actually could have left Germany, but he chose to stay with his people. And so he was in Theresienstadt. He did survive. And he decided to set up classes for the people there. That's one way to keep people's morale, you know, to teach them something to keep their minds off the horror going on around them. Now, in Israel, on Yom HaShoah, which again starts the evening of April 8th, there is a moment of silence, or actually it's 2.5 minutes, I believe. So I'm gonna play this piece for you. Everybody stops. I will say that at the very beginning, when Holocaust survivors came to Israel, they were actually not treated very well. There was a certain kind of shame around that, but that has changed. Oops. Let's go to the next one. Okay. There are a number of collections of people who give testimony about what they went through. The Shoah Foundation that was started by Steven Spielberg is one. So this is this woman's testimony where she's able to forgive the Nazis, which is pretty amazing.
One day in 1944, my family and I were arrested, packed into cattle trains with no food or water. We were taken to Poland and left on the selection platform in Auschwitz. A Nazi guard spotted me and my identical twin sister Miriam clinging to my mother. He tore us from my mother's arms and led us away. I remember looking back at my mother. I did not know at that time that I would never see her again. On the filthy floor were the scattered corpses of 3 little girls. Their bodies were naked and their eyes were wide open. It was a horrifying look. I have never seen anybody dead before. So that hit me very, very hard. And I made a silent pledge that I will do whatever is within my power to make sure that Miriam and I will not end up on that latrine floor and that we somehow will survive. Too bad. She's so young. She has only 2 weeks to live. I knew he was right, but I refused to die. If I died, Miriam would have been given a lethal injection so he could cut open both of our bodies and compare the autopsies. For the following 2 weeks, I was between life and death. And all I remember, crawling on the barrack floor because I no longer could walk. And as I was crawling, I would fade in and out of consciousness, and I kept telling myself, I must survive. I must survive. Nine months later, we returned home, only to find that nobody else from our family survived. To find only 3 crumbled pictures, and that was all that was left of my family. In 1987, I donated one of my kidneys to save her, but she died in 1993, and I was devastated. She was the only one from the family who was alive. I was angry. I was heading to Germany to meet a Nazi doctor. I was unbelievably nervous and scared. Dr. Munch at the time was 82 years old. He greeted me with kindness, respect, and consideration. I was blown away, a Nazi treating me with respect. Dr. Hans Munch was a bacteriologist at Auschwitz, but he also had a secondary job that he was stationed outside the gas chambers. And when people were dead, he would sign one death certificate, no names, just the number of people who were murdered. And he said to me, this is my problem. This is a nightmare that I live with. I asked him if he was willing to go with me to Auschwitz. and make the same statement that he made to me. And he said he would love to. I knew that was a crazy idea to thank a Nazi, a survivor of Auschwitz, to thank a Nazi. People would think that I have lost my mind. I tried to figure out how to thank him, and after 10 months, a simple idea popped into my head. How about a letter of forgiveness from me, the survivor of Auschwitz? I knew that that was a meaningful gift for him, but what I discovered for myself was life-changing, that I had the power to forgive. No one could give me that power, no one could take it away. To challenge myself, I decided I could even forgive Mengele, the person who had put me through hell. It wasn't easy, but I felt an enormous weight had been lifted from me. I finally felt free. Who decided that I, as a victim, must be for the rest of my life sad, angry, feel hopeless and helpless? I refuse it. You can never change what happened in the past. All you can do is change how you react to it. My sister and I were made into human guinea pigs. Our whole family was murdered. But I have the power to forgive, and so do you.
Unbelievable. That, I mean, that is really unbelievable.
It's, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
I want to not end with that. I want to end with something a little more uplifting.
Suzanne?
Yeah.
Um, you know what I thought of in watching that was we have to forgive God, because what is the alternative? You know, because I've really been thinking about this a lot. It's like, well, how the fuck did this happen? You know, like, and I don't know. I don't have the ability to understand, but I do know that living without God is not an option for me. You know, so she kind of gave me a path to that by just listening to her story, you know, that we have to forgive God.
Well, you know, we are going to discuss different ideas of God in Judaism. And again, I don't expect you to read the entire book by the time the class happens. I was hoping people would do a little bit at a time, and also you can read after the class. It doesn't have to be all before the class. You have to, you know, kind of think about what do we mean by God?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the people who wrote a very, I think, convincing way of understanding God is Harold Kushner, who didn't go through the Holocaust, but he lost his teenage son
Mm-hmm.
to a very rare disease. And so how do you square that with God? And he says, you know, God is, you know, we think of God as all good and all powerful, but you can't have both. That doesn't work. And you can't give up on God being all good. So you have to give up on God being all powerful. So, you know, God can only do so much.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, one way of understanding it, you know. And then you have to talk about what forgiveness means.
Mm-hmm.
Does forgiveness mean, you know, you're off the hook? See, my feeling about forgiveness, and I mentioned before the story, you know, the Sunflower by Wiesenthal,
Mm-hmm.
which examines forgiveness from a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different essays. First of all, can you forgive someone who hasn't asked for forgiveness, right? Mengele didn't ask for forgiveness, so I don't think he's entitled to forgiveness. If you don't ask for forgiveness and recognize what you did, which apparently this other doctor sort of did, then, you know, how can you forgive?
Mhm.
But you can maybe let go of allowing that person to have the kind of power over you, right? Which is what I think at the end of this story, she said, you know, it sort of freed her.
Mhm.
Because otherwise you're hanging on to this anger and the pain and all of that. And you have to be able to let that go to some extent. Now, I don't think you can ever completely let it go. You know, my mother, I never told her you should go. I mean, I suggested therapy might be helpful. She didn't really want to do it, but I didn't feel like I could tell her how to deal with this experience. I mean, everybody has to figure it out for themselves. And it's not something that, you know, you resolve. You just don't resolve that. It's with you forever. And it's with your children and even your grandchildren, right? I mean, it's just something that's there and it's never going to go away. And you just have to be able to cope with it. You know, it's like if you, let's say, couldn't walk, you have to cope with the idea that you have to use a wheelchair. It's not going to be like you can walk all of a sudden. Same thing with this kind of trauma. You're not going to get rid of the trauma. It's always going to be there. But then, you know, how do you, you know, somehow live and have some hope even with that trauma? And, you know, people, you know, it's interesting because I realized when I saw that 9-hour Shoah film, everybody had a different experience, right? That first of all, you went in with a different kind of experience from your family and who you were and everything. And, you know, people who had to shovel, you know, dead bodies into the ovens had a different experience from people who were, let's say, working in a weapons factory, you know. So everybody had their own particular experience and their own particular approach to it. And, you know, there's really no common way of dealing with it.
Rabbi, I
Yeah.
think when I was in Cambodia and we were touring the killing fields and some of the schools that Cambodia had turned into their camps, and the person who was giving us the tour, in fact, my guide throughout much of Cambodia had grown up in the camps and had somehow survived. And somebody had said, "Wow, that must be a lot of counseling that you would need to be able to live now." And he went, "Well, one, you can't find counseling in Cambodia, and two, how do you counsel through that? And three, sometimes you simply have to choose to survive."
Yeah.
And that was interesting because that came up over and over again in our, both in Cambodia, but also in Vietnam, which are also similar dialogues that we hear a lot about the Shoah.
Yeah. And as Tammy also says, it's not what happens to us, it's how we let it affect us. And Viktor Frankl talks about how you respond to horrible situations. There's always a choice in how you respond. Of course, our choices are limited when we go through something like this. So I'm sorry to leave you on this note because it's very, very sad and difficult. But maybe we can, you know, email each other and process this a little bit via email. So I will send you information about Yom HaShoah and the various offerings we're going to have. And I hope that you don't have nightmares tonight. So I'm going to say goodbye and hope that your week is okay. And we'll communicate via email and try to see what we can do with this. So
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you,
Hey,
everybody.
Ray.
Thank
Just
you,
take
everybody.
self-care, folks.
Okay.
Self-care.